Hey there. Welcome to Dark Lullabies. How was your day? I'm so glad you're here, and I really hope I can help you relax and find some peace tonight. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Okay, let's get started with the first story. Story 1. I grew up thinking of our place in the Appalachians as the most peaceful spot on earth, the kind of place people put on postcards and Instagram feeds. My parents bought a little cabin high up in the hills of eastern Kentucky before I was born, a squat, tired thing tucked into a hollow with a view of the ridgeline and just enough land for kids to run themselves ragged. They weren't skiers, like a lot of mountain people out west. My dad, Mark, was more of a fix what's broken, and then sit on the porch with coffee guy. And my mom, Angela, just loved the quiet. By the time this happened, the cabin was already older than I was by decades, sagging in the middle, pipes that groaned in winter, floorboards that knew every step we took. He was always under it or on top of it, patching something, cursing the wind and the rot, talking about how one day he'd knock the whole thing down and build something straight and new. I never took him seriously. Kids don't think anything that's always been there can ever really go away. I was 8 that winter. My brother back then, we just called him Cal, short for Caleb, was 11. That perfect age where he was old enough to drag me into anything and still young enough to believe we were invincible. It had been snowing for 2 days straight. That heavy, wet Appalachian snow that makes the forest go quiet and pushes the sky right down on top of you. Our place sat near the end of a narrow gravel road that twisted up the ridge and just stopped. A couple other properties were scattered along it. Old family cabins and hunting camps, some empty 9 months out of the year. At the very end was a bigger house that looked newer than the rest, set back behind a thin line of poplars and pine, with a wide porch that faced the hollow like it was watching us. It'd only ever seen cars there a handful of times, mostly in the summer. To us, it was just the neighbor's place, an almost ghost of a house we used as a landmark when we played outside. Snow days up there weren't about screens or sledding hills. For us, it was war. Cal and I had this elaborate snow game we made up, part capture the flag, part hide and seek. We'd pick bases anywhere on the property as long as we showed each other and build low walls out of packed snow. Then each make one huge snowball, the jewel that had to be stolen from the other fort and brought back to your own without getting hit. The road that dead-ended at the neighbor's place made the perfect battlefield. You could either cut through the scraggly woods and pop out near their driveway, or you could follow the curve of the road and come in head-on. That afternoon, the drifts were already higher than my boots, and the sky had this dim, yellowish light you get in the mountains before dark when the clouds are thick and the snow's still falling. The wind made the trees hiss. My dad was chopping wood near the shed, the steady thunk of his axe the only sound. Mom had layered us up so much I could barely bend my elbows, but I didn't care. Cal decided he wanted the more advanced base, and announced that he was taking the end of the road property, way down by that newer house. He knew I'd be too scared to argue. He pointed his whistle at me, the cheap plastic one Mom had bought us at a gas station, and told me to go pick my fort closer to our cabin and wait until he blew it to start the game. I watched him jog off down the road until the snow swallowed him, the orange of his jacket flickering between the trees. I picked a spot near the bend in the drive where our yard sloped down toward the brush line and packed my little fort together, glancing up every few seconds, waiting for that shrill whistle. 5 minutes went by, then 10. The cold air burned my nostrils, and the snow had piled onto my hood so much that every time I moved, a little avalanche slid down my back. I told myself he was just being a jerk, dragging it out to build suspense. But underneath that, I could feel a different kind of nervousness starting to coil in my stomach. The woods behind the cabin, the ones that dropped off into the hollow, were beautiful in summer. In the middle of a snowstorm at 8 years old, they were something else entirely. Dark lines of tree trunks and black tangled branches against all that white, like something waiting for you to step too far in. I had a choice. Cut through those woods and pop out near the neighbor's place, or follow the road down like he had. The idea of threading myself between those bare trees with the snow still coming down, the wind sighing through the ravine, made my skin crawl. So I chose the road. My boots sank with each step as I trudged down, breath puffing out in weak little clouds, snowflakes pricking at my eyelashes. The world felt muffled, like I was underwater. When I reached the last stretch before the end of the road, I slowed down and peered through the stand of trees that separated the gravel from the neighbor's clearing. From there, you could normally see everything: their porch, the swing, the big picture window facing the hollow. That day, the snow softened the edges, but I could still see enough to know that the yard was empty. No bright orange jacket, no brother, no footprints crossing the open space where he would have built his fort. I cut into the woods instead of walking up their driveway, more out of habit than any real strategy, using the trees as cover, feeling very secret agent about it, even with my heart hammering. Up close, I saw it. His fort, a lopsided wall of snow pushed up near the far corner of their front yard, close to the tree line. It was definitely his because I could see his handprints in the packed snow, the weird diagonal way he always smoothed the edges, but no sign of him. I stepped out from behind the last pine, my boots squeaking on the crusted snow, and scanned the yard. The house itself seemed wrong, somehow. In my memory, that porch was just a porch. That day, it looked more like a stage, empty but expectant. There was a single rocking chair tipped slightly to one side, a pair of big muddy work boots just inside the glass storm door, leaving a wet stain on the mat, even though, as far as I knew, no one was supposed to be staying there. A long hunting knife lay on the porch rail, blade pointed down, a thin red-brown smear near the edge that my 8-year-old brain immediately labeled as rust, because the other option was too awful to consider. The snow around the boots was slushy, recently melted, and that detail stuck to me like a burr. Someone had come here on foot not long ago, and yet I could see no car. No truck, no tire tracks cutting into the driveway. I started toward Cal's fort, thinking maybe he was just hiding behind it, waiting to jump out and nail me with a snowball. I could see the imprint where Head probably been kneeling. The jewel, a half-shaped ball, lay half buried in the powder behind the wall. The air felt tight in my chest. Then a woman's voice cut through the snowfall, too clear, too sudden. "Hey, honey, are you looking for your brother?" It came from the front door. I jerked around so fast I almost slipped. An older woman stood behind the glass storm door, holding it half open with one hand. She wore a faded flannel shirt and jeans, gray hair pulled back, cheeks red from the cold. To anyone else, she might have looked like somebody's grandmother, the kind of woman who'd hand kids hot chocolate and complain about the price of heating oil. But there was something in her eyes that didn't match the rest of her. Something too bright and too still at the same time. Her smile went all the way to her teeth, but not at all to her pupils. I just stared at her for a second before I managed to croak out that my brother and I were playing a game, that He'd come down here to make his fort, that I was trying to find him. She said calmly, through that not quite right smile, that he wasn't there, that Shed been out front for a while and hadn't seen him, that maybe He'd gone back to my house. The words sounded normal enough, but my skin prickled. Behind her, through the dark hallway, I could see more piles of boots, several coats on hooks, a cooler pushed up against the wall like someone had been leaving in a hurry and never did. There were too many shoes for a house that was supposed to be empty. I took a few cautious steps closer, boots crunching, and as I did, something in the upstairs window above her shoulder caught my eye. At first, I thought it was just my reflection in the glass, but then it moved. A face, half hidden by the frame, peered down at me. Whoever it was wore a black knit cap pulled low. Only one eye and a sliver of cheek were visible above the window sash. The lower half of the face was hidden, either by the sill or something else. It stayed perfectly still, staring down, and I had this ridiculous flash of hope that maybe it was Cal, that had somehow gotten inside and was watching, about to yell, "Got you!" But the eye was wrong. Older, harder. There was no curiosity in it, only calculation. The woman followed my gaze up for a split second and then back to me. Her smile twitched. I also noticed then that there were 2 sets of footprints leading up to the front steps. One smaller, like my brother's, and one larger, deeper in the snow, clearly belonging to an adult. The smaller set made it to the top of the steps and then overlapped itself, turned around, and went straight back off the porch toward the tree line at a sharp angle, as if someone had changed their mind mid-step. The larger prints only went one way up. The woman pushed the storm door open wider and motioned with her free hand, telling me I should come inside for a minute, warm up, maybe call my parents, that it was too cold to be out there alone. Her tone was casual, but my heart was suddenly pounding in my ears. I didn't move. Something old and animal in me started screaming. I did the only thing I could think to do. I filled my lungs and yelled my brother's name as loud as I could, the sound tearing the quiet in half. "Caleb!" It came out high and shaky, echoing off the trees. I waited, holding my breath. No answer. What I did hear, faint but unmistakable, was movement from inside the house, above me. Heavy footsteps crossing a room, then the dull scuff of what sounded like a chair being pushed back. The woman's smile vanished like someone had flipped a switch. Her eyes sharpened, annoyed. There was a thud, then the muted rattle of a chain on wood, like someone had just taken it off a door. And under it, just barely, a man's voice saying something low and sharp that I couldn't make out. In that instant, I could picture my brother standing at those steps earlier, being told those same lines, being asked to come inside, and then something making him run. I suddenly understood the doubled footprints. Every part of me lit up with one message: go. I stumbled backward, boots slipping in the churned-up snow by the fort, my throat too tight to speak. The woman called out something I don't even remember the words, only the edge in them now, that the sugary tone was gone. She took a step onto the porch, the knife on the rail glinting beside her hand, and for a heartbeat I thought she was reaching for it. The upstairs window was empty now. Whatever had been watching me had moved. I turned and ran. I didn't think about being quiet or strategic or about the game anymore. I barreled through the trees and back toward the road, my breath coming in sharp little sobs, the snow grabbing at my legs. Halfway there, a sharp whistle cut through the air from up the hill, the one my dad always used at dinner time. 3 notes that meant come home. Now, I followed the sound like it was a lifeline. When our cabin came into view, lights glowing dull yellow through the snow and smoke curling from the chimney, I nearly collapsed with relief. My dad and Cal were already in the driveway, both looking down the road toward where he'd come from. Cal's face was pale under his knit cap, eyes red like he'd been crying or yelling. Dad's jaw was clenched tight in that way that meant something was very wrong. Before I could catch my breath enough to talk, Cal started babbling about how he'd gone to build his fort, how a woman had come out onto the porch at the end house and asked if he wanted to come inside and warm up, how she said she had hot chocolate. He said there was a man's shadow moving behind her in the hallway, big and still, and that something about it made the hairs on his neck stand up. When she opened the door wider, he said he'd smelled cigarette smoke and a sour, sweaty smell like people had been sitting in a car too long. He'd told her our dad was expecting him back soon and bolted, cutting across the yard toward the woods instead of going back down the drive, hearing someone behind him call out sharply but not daring to look back until he hit the tree line. He'd run all the way home and told Dad, who'd grabbed the old metal flashlight and the tire iron he kept by the door and was on his way to get me when he saw me stumbling up the road. I added my version in between gasps, the woman's too wide smile, the half-seen face in the upstairs window, the mismatched footprints, the sound of someone big moving inside the house after I yelled. I told him about the knife on the rail and the boots just inside the door, even though the owners weren't supposed to be around. Something hardened in his expression that he'd never seen before. He told us to get inside and stay with Mom, to lock the door and not open it for anyone but him. Then he walked down that road alone, into the thickening snow with a tire iron in his hand. Those 30 or 40 minutes felt like hours. Mom kept peeking through the blinds, one hand on the phone, the other on my shoulder. Cal kept pacing, his gloves still on, like if he stopped moving, he'd fall apart. When Dad finally came back, his beard and jacket crusted with snow, he looked more tired than he'd ever seen him. He said no one had answered the door at the end house. The knife was gone from the rail. The work boots were still inside, but the puddle beneath them had spread. Head pounded on the door, called out, circled the house. There were more footprints in the yard now than there had been when I was there. some leading into the woods behind the house, others circling back toward the road. The side yard by the basement windows was a churn of prints and drag marks in the snow. He hadn't liked the feeling of it at all. Instead of forcing his way in like I know part of him wanted to, he did something smarter. He walked to the next house down the road, where the year-round neighbors lived, people who actually knew the owners of that end property. They answered in slippers and flannel, confused, and called the owners right there on the spot. The owners said they were 3 states away for the season and that no one, absolutely no one, was supposed to be in their house. That's when the sheriff got involved. The deputies came rumbling up in their trucks not long after, lights flashing weakly against the falling snow. They took our statements separately, asked us to describe the woman, asked about the face in the window, the footprints, the sounds. One of them listened without writing anything down for a long time, just watching our faces. They said they found the back door of the end house unlocked. Inside, they told my dad later, the place looked like someone had been camping there for a few days. Blankets pulled off beds and piled on the floor, empty food cans in the sink, a couple of cheap beer bottles, cigarette butts in a mug. Whoever they were had gone through drawers and closets, piling anything that looked valuable in one corner of the living room, as if they'd been waiting for a ride or for the weather to clear so they could haul it all out. But the creepiest detail wasn't the mess. It was what my dad saw when the deputy let him stand just inside the doorway for a moment after they'd cleared the house. A length of bright orange paracord coiled neatly on the coffee table, loops of duct tape half torn on top of it, and on the hallway floor near the front door, a knit glove small enough to fit a kid's hand, wet and muddy as if it had just been dropped in a hurry. He never told me that part until years later, but I think he suspected even then that those things weren't meant for the owners. They were meant for whoever might be foolish enough to step inside. Before we left that trip, Mom made him go back with her during the day to pack up anything at our own cabin that might tempt a desperate stranger, old rifles, tools, even my grandfather's watch he kept in the bedside table. When they came back, pale and quiet, Dad mentioned one last thing in a low voice. There had been fresh boot prints in our own driveway that morning, separate from his, leading up to our porch and stopping just short of the front steps, as if someone had stood there for a while, watching the house, deciding whether to come closer. The snow had only partially filled them in. We never played in that neighbor's yard again. Honestly, we barely looked at that end house if we could help it. Eventually, the owners sold it, and someone new painted the porch, replaced the rail, planted flowers. You'd never know what almost happened there on that snow-choked day at the end of the hollow. I think about it now that I'm grown and realize how thin the line was between a creepy childhood memory and a true crime headline. If Cal hadn't trusted his gut and turned around when he did, if Id stepped 1 foot over that threshold, if my dad had brushed it off as our imagination, those ifs still keep me up some nights when the wind howls down our own street. I know this sounds like the kind of story people exaggerate over time, but every detail of that woman's too wide smile and that single watching eye is still sharp in my mind. If you ever had a moment like that in your own childhood, one of those close calls you didn't understand until later, I'd honestly like to hear it in the comments. If only so, I know we weren't the only kids who walked right up to the edge of something terrible and somehow made it back. Story 2. I've been on skis almost as long as I've been able to string memories together, which is funny considering I grew up in a part of the Appalachians that most people picture as coal dust and hollers, not chairlifts and rental shops. My parents met as teenagers racing at a little mom-and-pop resort in southern West Virginia, the kind of place with one main lift and a lodge that always smelled like chili and wet wool. They never went pro or anything, but they took skiing seriously enough that teaching their kids to love it felt less like a hobby and more like a family obligation. By the time this story happened, I was 21, a senior in college, home on winter break with the usual restless need to squeeze something memorable out of those few weeks. We'd graduated from the rickety hill my parents grew up on to a much bigger resort, a couple hours deeper into the mountains. A sprawling place, tucked into a valley with multiple peaks and enough lifts that you could get genuinely lost if you weren't paying attention. He'll call it Black Elk Ridge, though that's not its real name. That weekend, it was me, my roommates, Logan and Drew, and our friend Mason. who had a beat-up SUV that somehow always made it over the iced switchbacks, no matter how bald the tires got. Our other friend, Cole, the human trail map, had bailed last minute for a family thing, which would end up mattering way more than we realized. We'd skied there enough to know our favorites, tree runs that snaked through the pines, a couple of steep black diamonds that emptied out into wide, forgiving bowls, but this trip had that particular energy of maybe the last time we're all free like this, so we were pushing ourselves, racing each other, ducking into glades we probably shouldn't have. It was one of those cold, blue sky days where the air hurts, but the sun tricks you into thinking it doesn't. The only thing that felt off was the board near the main lodge that day. A cluttered bulletin board with local ads and ski school flyers, and tucked off to the side, a cluster of faded missing posters. Most of them were old, weather-buckled, and half-torn, but one was relatively recent, maybe a year or two old. A college-age guy in a beanie holding a snowboard, last seen at this very mountain, separated from his group after leaving a bar with friends. I remember staring at that phrase, "left with friends," and feeling a tiny, weird chill at how vague it was, then shrugging it off because it was easier to assume he'd just run off to start a new life somewhere warm. That's what you do with other people's tragedies when you're 21 and sure you're untouchable. We spent most of the day bouncing around the mountain, fueled by gas station breakfast and cheap fireball shooters we'd smuggled into the pockets of our jackets. Logan and Mason owned their own expensive skis and talked endlessly about edge angles and stiffness and whatever else. Drew and I rented like we always did. By late afternoon, our legs felt like concrete, but there was that hour before the lifts closed where none of us wanted to admit it was almost over. We were loitering near the top of one of the higher chairs, arguing about which run to make our last, when two girls slid over to us, no helmets, goggles up, cheeks flushed from the cold. I remember how my brain kind of stuttered because they were both almost unnervingly pretty, in that sharp-featured, confident way you don't usually see at sleepy Appalachian resorts full of families and middle-aged guys in neon 80 seconds jackets. One was brunette with a crooked little scar on her chin, the other blonde with eyes so light they almost looked gray. They introduced themselves as Brooke and Lila, said they were bored out of their minds because the mountain felt like a senior citizens field trip, and we were basically the only group that looked roughly their age. It made a certain kind of sense. Logan lit up instantly. Mason turned on his usual over-the-top charm, and suddenly it was easy to forget how strange it was that two strangers with perfect teeth and no helmets had zero hesitation about coasting up to four sweaty guys who looked like they'd slept in their flannels. They noticed the flask poking out of Mason's pocket and made a joke about Fireball being training wheels, and before I knew it, Brooke was pulling a small, unlabeled stainless steel bottle from inside her jacket, the kind of thing people usually use for coffee on cold mornings. She said something teasing about us needing to try the real stuff, and the guys leaned into it the way I knew they would. The liquid burned darker and sharper than cinnamon whiskey when it hit my tongue the first time, almost chemical under the taste of cheap liquor, and that was the first thing that really pinged my radar. I still swallowed, but I made a mental note to pace myself. They asked if we'd ever skied a place called Raven Hollow, a glade run I didn't recognize. Cole would have known every square inch of that trail map, but he wasn't there, and the name wasn't printed anywhere I'd seen. Lila explained that it was an old tree run. The resort rarely opened anymore because the terrain was too gnarly, and patrol hated going in there, but that if you knew where to drop in, it linked back to the main system. It sounded like exactly the kind of secret, off-the-map adventure story we'd brag about later. The way she described it, with those narrow chutes between pines and sudden drops, made me think she actually knew the place. And the thought of gliding through a quiet, untouched section of woods as our last run had a dangerous appeal. We followed them off a blue trail to a weird choke point where the trees pressed close and the snow was almost completely untracked. They told us we had to unclip and hike a little bit uphill to reach the entrance. That alone should have been a red flag. You don't usually have to hike up at a resort unless you're cutting into something you're not supposed to ski. The deeper we walked into the woods, the quieter it got. The sounds of lifts and music from the lodge faded, replaced by the soft metallic rattle of our skis knocking against each other on our shoulders and the occasional crack of a branch shedding snow. We stepped over a half-buried rope strung loosely between two trees with a weather-beaten sign attached, the letters mostly worn away. but you could still make out closed and patrol only under a film of frost. Next to it, nailed into the trunk like some kind of trophy, was an old ski helmet, cracked almost clean in two, with a dark, rust-colored stain along the fracture line and the faint outline where a lift ticket had once been clipped. Beneath it, half covered in snow, lay a neatly coiled length of nylon rope, newer than everything else, bright against the white. Logan made some stupid joke about it being the entrance fee, but nobody really laughed. My gut twisted even harder, but the girls just kept walking, like they'd stepped over that sign 100 times. After a few minutes, the slope started to angle downward again, and they told us we were close. We clipped back into our bindings at the top of a narrow opening in the trees where the mountain seemed to funnel into a natural chute. Brooke unscrewed her bottle again, said we couldn't christen Raven Hollow without a proper toast, and passed it around. Mason and Logan took big swallows, emboldened by attention and adrenaline. Drew accepted it, said he was already buzzed, and tried to hand it back, but Brooke gave him this sharp little look, the flirtiness dropping for half a heartbeat, and he relented and took a quick sip. When the bottle got to me, that chemical tang from earlier hit my nose before the mouth of it touched my lips. Every alarm bell in my body went off at once. I raised it, tilted it, let the liquid brush my lower lip, and faked a swallow, letting it slide back into the bottle while I made a show of wincing. Brooke watched me carefully, eyes narrowing just a fraction, then screwed the lid on and slipped it back inside her jacket. I realized then that I hadn't actually seen either of them drink from it once. I checked. My phone service was patchy, but the time was clear. Maybe 40 minutes until last chair. I mumbled something about how if this run spit us out way off from the main base, we might not make it to the lot before they closed everything down. They brushed it off, said that Raven Hollow connected back to one of the lift lines and that we were wasting time overthinking it. Without further discussion, they dropped in, carving between the trees with a confidence that, in hindsight, might have been as much about knowing where they were going as knowing that we didn't. Mason and Logan went right after them like they were chasing something they couldn't afford to lose. Drew hesitated, shot me a look that said he had the same knot in his stomach that I did, then tipped his skis over the lip and followed. I went last, telling myself my job was to play sweep and make sure no one wrapped themselves around a tree. For a few minutes, it actually was fun. The snow was softer and deeper in there. The trees tight enough to be thrilling, but not impossibly so. And that muffled forest quiet wrapped around us in a way that felt almost sacred. But gradually I started to notice little things that didn't match the carefree run we had expected. The slope went on longer than it should have for a side glade, and instead of curving back toward the resort, the mountains seemed to be funneling us deeper into a part of the forest where I could no longer hear the distant hum of lifts or see any cut runs through the trees. A couple of times I thought I saw poles marking something, but when I got closer they were just broken branches or old, weathered bamboo bent under ice. By the time the trees started to thin out and the slope eased, my thighs were burning and that unease had settled firmly between my shoulder blades. We popped out into a small clearing at the bottom of a shallow ravine, surrounded by forest on all sides. No lift, no buildings, no trail markers, just a wide, flat expanse of snow that didn't look like it had seen much traffic all season. Brooke and Lila were standing together near the middle of it, skis off, talking quietly. Logan and Mason were sprawled in the snow nearby, laughing about something, their helmets off, hair damp with sweat. Drew slid in beside me, and I could see the realization dawning in his face at the same time as mine. We were off the resort's official grid, and if something went wrong here, it would be a while before anyone stumbled across us. I started to ask the girls where exactly this supposed connecting lift was when I heard a heavy thump behind me. I turned around and saw Logan flat on his back in the snow where Head just been standing, limbs loose in a way that made no sense. For a split second, I thought Head just thrown himself down out of exhaustion. But then his head lolled to one side and his eyes didn't quite focus. Brooke laughed, said something about him being a lightweight in a tone that didn't quite match the sharp interest in her gaze, and as she spoke, Mason's knees buckled. He dropped his poles, took a staggering step, and tipped forward like someone had cut his strings. Panic rose in my throat so fast it made me dizzy. I scrambled out of my bindings and knelt beside them. They were breathing, lids fluttering, but unresponsive when I shook their shoulders. Their skin had gone a shade too pale under the windburn. Drew took a step toward the girls, voice low and steady in that way he had when he was trying not to lose it, asking what the hell they'd given us. They blinked, feigning confusion, insisted they had no idea, that maybe the shots and altitude had caught up with them. As he closed the distance between them, I saw Drew sway, his face slacken. It was like watching a wave roll through his body from the inside. 1 second he was upright and furious. The next he was sagging to his knees, and then into the snow, consciousness draining away as cleanly as if someone had flipped a switch. I could feel something similar starting to nibble at the edges of my own awareness, my heartbeat thudding too loud in my ears. A spin to the world that had nothing to do with the slope, but it was dulled compared to the others, slowed. I clung to that difference like it was a rope. The girls' faces changed, then dropped the bright, approachable ski bunny act. Lila's mouth flattened into a thin line, her eyes assessing, almost bored. Brooke glanced at me and said, in this flat, annoyed tone, that I must not have drunk enough. She sounded less frightened than inconvenienced. They didn't bolt right away. They moved with this terrible, methodical calm, unclipping their own skis, then stepping around our crumpled bodies to strip Logan and Mason's skis as well, stacking the expensive pairs together and leaving the rentals. I remember fixating on Mason's glove lying a few inches from his hand, fingers curled like it had tried to hold on to something. My body felt like it belonged to someone else, heavy and uncooperative, but I was still awake, still trapped in it. I tried to push myself up, and my arms trembled uselessly. I demanded again to know what they'd given us, my voice slurred, the words barely making it out of my mouth. They didn't answer. They didn't even look down, like it'd been downgraded from threat to background noise. After a minute, Brooke told Leela they needed to move, that they'd be waiting, and they started trudging through the snow toward the tree line at the far end of the clearing, each one carrying 2 pairs of skis over their shoulders. Somewhere in the fog, a stubborn little voice told me that if they got over that ridge with our stuff, there was a good chance we'd wake up in the dark with no gear, no sense of direction, and rapidly dropping temperatures if we woke up at all. The thought of my parents getting a phone call that Id just quietly vanished off a mountain they'd grown up on snapped something in me. I lay there and counted, focusing on my breathing, waiting for the numbness to ebb even a fraction. Slowly, feeling seeped back into my fingers and toes like pins and needles, I rolled onto my side, then my knees, and finally forced myself upright. My legs shook but held. I followed their tracks, stumbling at first, then steadier, ducking behind trees when I needed to catch my breath. It was eerie how far they'd already gotten. They moved like people who'd done this exact hike many times before. After a few minutes, the trees thinned ahead, and I saw a break in the forest where the snow gave way to plowed asphalt. I stopped just inside the last line of pines and peered out. There was a narrow access road, one Id never noticed from the main resort side, and parked just off to the shoulder was a dark blue van, the kind with no side windows and salt crusted around the wheel wells. The side door was already open. As I watched, 4 men climbed out and approached the girls. They weren't dressed like skiers, no bright jackets, no lift passes, just dark hoodies, work boots, baseball caps pulled low. From my hiding spot, I could hear the low murmur of voices, but not the words. One of the men gestured toward the skis, then toward the woods, like he was asking where the rest of the merchandise was. Brooke jerked her thumb back in the direction I'd come, and for a split second I thought she might mention that one of us was still on our feet. Then one of the guys turned his head and looked straight past her, his eyes scanning the tree line. His gaze slid over the spot where I was half hidden, and for a horrible, suspended second I was sure had made me. He said something sharp, and 2 of the others turned to look where he pointed. I pressed myself against the rough bark and held my breath. When I dared lean out again, I caught a glimpse inside the open van. A chaotic pile of gear, snowboards, skis, helmets, none of it matching. A couple of women's purses, a scattering of phones in the cup holder with their screens dark, and on the floor near the back, crumpled but unmistakable, a copy of the same missing poster I'd seen at the lodge, the edges dirty and stepped on. The man who'd pointed in my direction seemed to be arguing with the others, jabbing his finger toward the woods like he wanted to come after me, maybe tie up the loose end. And for a moment they all looked my way, and I realized with cold clarity that if they decided to fan out and search, the thin line of trees I was hiding behind wouldn't protect me for long. The thought of Logan and Mason lying face down in the snow, breaths shallow, hit me like a physical shove. I turned and started back the way it'd come, not even trying to move quietly. Every step felt like it echoed through the entire valley. I didn't look back to see if anyone followed. All I cared about was the fading groove of our tracks in the snow leading back to the clearing. When I got there, my friends were exactly where I'd left them, but their breathing sounded a little stronger, their skin a little less gray. I went to Drew first, slapping at his cheeks, scooping handfuls of cold snow and pressing them against his face until he sputtered and jerked and finally blinked up at me. Confusion, giving way to fear, as I poured everything out in a rush. The van, the men, the gear, the poster. Between the two of us, we managed to drag Logan and Mason under the shelter of some low pines and waited out, hearts pounding every time a branch snapped or the wind shifted, expecting to see dark shapes crest the hill. No one came. An hour later, maybe more. The other two started to stir, groggy and nauseous, complaining of pounding headaches and a weird heaviness in their limbs. We didn't waste time explaining in full. We just told them we'd been drugged, that our skis were gone, that we needed to start walking if we wanted any shot at making it back before full dark. The trek out of that ravine and back toward civilization was its own little nightmare, a combination of following half-erased tracks and gut instinct and the occasional distant whine of a snowmobile to orient ourselves. By the time we stumbled onto a groomed run, the lifts were shut down and the mountain was flattening into that eerie twilight quiet. Patrol found us halfway to the base, 4 exhausted, half-frozen guys, limping along with rental skis over our shoulders, and no coherent explanation. Telling the story to management and then to the county deputies in a back room of the lodge, under fluorescent lights, made it feel surreal, like we were trying to sell them on a plot from some low-budget thriller. To their credit, the cops didn't laugh. They took notes, asked us to describe the girls and the men and the van in as much detail as we could. A couple of patrollers were sent to sweep the area we indicated, but by the time they got there, Raven Hollow was just another quiet patch of woods. No van, no people, just some churned-up snow. A few discarded beer cans, and the rope we'd seen earlier, now gone. Our stolen skis never turned up. The resort comped our rentals and apologized a lot. The sheriff's office said they'd cross-reference our story with any open cases, that they'd be in touch. For a little while, there were murmurs about a possible theft ring targeting mountain resorts on local news. And one night, my mom texted me a link to a segment about 2 women suspected of luring men away from crowded bars in a town a couple of counties over. The grainy footage of them walking down a sidewalk together, naggingly familiar in their posture and the tilt of their heads. Nothing concrete ever came of it, at least not that we heard about. The toxicology reports on the blood samples we gave apparently showed traces of several different substances, none in huge amounts on their own, but enough in combination to knock a person out fast. The detective who called me months later said whoever did it knew exactly what they were mixing. That part stuck with me. Almost more than the van. The clinical precision of it. The way someone had sat down and calculated just how much it would take to drop a grown man in the snow before he could realize what was happening. It's been a few years now. We all graduated, moved to different cities, traded cheap lifts for office chairs and commutes. But every winter, when I see a group photo from some ski trip pop up on social media, people flushed and smiling, arms slung around each other, drinks in hand, I think about that bulletin board, those faded missing posters, and the line that said, "Last seen with friends." I think about how close we came to becoming a new sheet of paper thumbtacked next to them. I also think about all the little choices that added up to us not ending up in the back of that van. Cole not being there to navigate us safely away from bad ideas. My hesitation with the bottle. Drew's suspicion. The stubborn part of me that refused to stay down when my body wanted to shut off. It still makes my stomach knot if I let myself imagine the alternate version of that day. I don't know if anyone connected our case to anything bigger, or if those girls and the men they answered to ever got caught. But I do know this. The world can feel incredibly safe right up until the moment it really isn't. If you've ever had your own, we laughed about it at first and only later realized how close it was to something much worse kind of story, whether it was on a mountain, at a bar, or somewhere in between. I'd honestly like to hear it in the comments, partly because I'm curious, and partly because it helps to remember that trusting your gut, even when you can't fully explain why, can make all the difference. Story 3. Every winter, for as long as I can remember, my friends and I have had this dumb little tradition that somehow turned into something we took seriously. We'd drive up into the Appalachian hills to this remote reservoir outside a tiny town in eastern Tennessee, park in a gravel lot half swallowed by weeds, and walk out onto the frozen water in the middle of the night. It wasn't some big event anyone else knew about. No parties, no crowds, just the three of us. Me, Aaron, and Blake, trying to grab a few hours of that strange, heavy, quiet you only get when snow has smothered everything. During the day, you could see the dam and the spillway and a faded no swimming sign half buried in ice. But at night, it just felt like a blank silver plate dropped between dark tree lines. There are people who will hear that and think we were asking for trouble, and maybe we were. But we had our rules. We only went when it had been well below freezing for weeks. We stayed far from the thinnest-looking ice near the inflow, and we always stuck together. Over time, it stopped feeling reckless and just started feeling like ours. The reservoir was ringed by a thin stand of oak and pine, just enough of a tree screen that you couldn't drive a car right up to the edge, even if you wanted to. So we always parked in this beat-up turnout off the access road. It was one of those clear, brutally cold nights in late January when this happened. The kind where your breath feels like broken glass and your nose starts to sting the second you step outside. The sky wasn't completely clear, though. Low clouds reflected the glow from the far-off town, and a fat, pale moon kept ducking in and out, making everything alternately dim and bright. I remember liking that, the way it meant it would never get truly pitch black. We pulled into the lot a little after midnight, the heater in Blake's pickup still blasting our faces pink, and right away something felt different. Usually the lot was untouched when we came. Maybe a dusting of old tire ruts from trucks that had been there weeks ago, but that night there were fresh tracks. A set of wide tread tires that had turned in a tight circle and backed up toward the thin stand of trees instead of parking straight. The snow was churned up in one corner of the lot like someone had spent a long time idling there. Beside the tire marks were boot prints, not just one set, but at least two. One, a normal adult stride, the other smaller, closer together, as if a kid had been walking just ahead or just behind. The smaller prints stopped short of the trees, turned abruptly, and vanished under where the truck must have been sitting. The adult prints went all the way to the brush and disappeared into the dark. I remember all three of us going quiet for a second, just staring at it, our cigarette smoke mixing in little gray curls above the snow. I told myself it was probably just somebody coming to smoke or drink by the water, maybe turning around when they realized how bad the road had gotten. There was no car there now, no red glow of taillights, and the silence was absolute. The weirdness faded enough that the habit took over. We grabbed our flashlights and walked down the narrow path toward the reservoir, boots squeaking on packed snow, the smell of cold and wet bark and stale tobacco clinging to our jackets. Once we broke through the tree line, the view opened up the way it always did, making me feel like I'd stepped out of a hallway and onto a stage. The reservoir was a wide, flat expanse of ice, stretching into the dark on both sides, rimmed by tree-covered hills that rose in layers like shadows stacked on top of shadows. The moon slid out from a cloud and painted everything in that weird blue-white light that never looks as good in photos as it feels in your chest. This is the part of the tradition I love the most. That first moment when you step out and realize you can see your breath, but also see every detail in the snow around you. The soft drift of flakes, the way your footprints trail behind you like a dotted line to shore. We always tested the ice the same way. Blake picked up a fist-sized rock near the shoreline and lobbed it high onto the reservoir, where it landed with a clean echo and skittered across the surface without even threatening to crack. He grinned, teeth bright in the dim light, and called it good. I remember offering a token protest about being careful, but I still followed when he and Aaron stepped out onto the ice, that familiar jitter of fear and thrill mixing in my stomach. We were maybe 100 feet from the edge, far enough that the trees behind us looked thin, and the dam to our left was just a darker smudge against the white, when I noticed something off in the ice ahead. At first I thought it was just a wind pattern or some kind of shadow, but as we drew closer it resolved into a small, circular patch where the surface looked different from the rest, duller, cloudier, the edges rough like they'd been hacked at and then refrozen. Someone had broken through here recently, maybe a few days before, and the water beneath had frozen over again into an uneven scab. Embedded under that cloudy skin, so faint I almost dismissed it, was a darker shape that wasn't quite uniform, something slender and pale. Maybe a branch, or maybe not, pressed into the ice like it had been caught while the water hardened. You know how your brain will sometimes present you with the worst possible interpretation of something in the blink of an eye? Mine did that then. For a second I saw not a branch, but fingers. 4 of them, blurred and reaching. I blinked hard and looked again, forcing myself to see wood and shadow and nothing else. Even so, the air felt thinner around us. Aaron must have seen it too, because he veered to the right a little without saying anything, giving the spot a wide berth while pretending to adjust his hat. None of us spoke up, and that silence said more than any joke would have. The farther out we walked, the more the sound of the world changed. Our voices, when we did speak, seemed to carry in strange ways, as if they had nowhere to land. The snow muffled any distant road noise, and all that was left were the crisp, regular taps of our boots on ice and the occasional hiss of wind. It's hard to explain if you've never been somewhere that remote at night, but there's a moment where the quiet stops being peaceful and starts feeling like a held breath, like the landscape is waiting to see what you'll do. We were standing near the rough middle of the reservoir, having one of those morbid conversations about which of us would fall through first if that old patch wasn't as solid as it looked, when something moved on the far side of the lake. It wasn't much at first, just a darker smudge pulling free from the tree line, but we all saw it and fell silent. The shape was big and low to the ground, shuffling instead of striding, and for a second my brain offered up black bear, which isn't unheard of in that part of the Appalachians even in winter. My heartbeat doubled. A bear on ice with nowhere to run is not a situation anyone wants. We stood frozen, not wanting to startle it, not wanting to make ourselves look bigger here on the flat, featureless surface. As it got closer, though, the outline became wrong in all the small, uncanny ways that make your skin crawl. It seemed to have shoulders that moved separately from its torso, not the rolling bulk of an animal. Its gait was oddly careful, not the fluid, 4-legged lope I expected. When it reached the edge of the reservoir, it straightened up. The bear uncoiled into a person, a tall man wearing what looked like a full-body suit of matted dark fur or something close to it, the headpiece pulled back so his face was exposed. He had what looked like a leather muzzle dangling from one hand, a dog training thing maybe, or some kind of weird hunting gear with straps and buckles that glinted under the moon. From the distance, his features were impossible to make out, but I saw enough to register the slick shine of his hair plastered to his forehead with sweat and the way his breath blasted out in angry clouds. In his other hand, trailing behind him, was a rope. The rope led back to an object he was dragging across the snow near the tree line. Whatever it was thumped dully every time it hit a buried rock or root. It was small and tightly wrapped in a dark plastic tarp or heavy trash bag cinched with duct tape, no bigger than a duffel. With every jolt, it made a sound that was wrong on some deep level to my ears, soft but solid. Not the empty clatter of bottles or cans, not the clink of gear. Something about it made my throat go dry. He walked with purpose, heading toward the spot not far from that old refrozen hole we'd noticed earlier. Eyes down, attention focused on the ice at his feet like he was choosing a particular place. Very slowly, very quietly, Aaron tapped my arm and jerked his chin back toward shore. We all instinctively started edging that way, trying to move without drawing attention, footsteps suddenly sounding absurdly loud. The ice didn't crack or groan, but it felt noisy anyway. We barely made it a dozen steps when the man's head snapped up. Even from that distance, I could tell his gaze locked onto us. For a heartbeat, everyone on that reservoir held still. Us in the open, him at the edge, that ugly bundle weighing down his arm. Then, in a voice that carried far too well over the flat expanse of ice, he shouted something, maybe just "hey," maybe something more. I couldn't actually make out the words, only the tone, sharp and irritated. Like Wed interrupted him in the middle of a job. I didn't turn to look at my friends. I just started running, lungs jolting, boots hammering against the ice. I was more afraid of being within arm's reach of whatever he was doing than I was of falling through. The cold air burned like knives in my chest after maybe 30 seconds. My legs felt leaden and clumsy in my insulated pants. We passed the old patch of refrozen ice in a wide arc, and I couldn't stop myself from cutting a glance down as we went. The cloudy surface had fractured slightly since we first walked by, hairline cracks spiderwebbing outward from the center. Through one of them, illuminated just right by the moon, I caught a clearer glimpse of what was trapped underneath. Something pale and thin, bent at an angle that didn't look like wood. I snapped my eyes away so fast my vision blurred, focusing instead on the tree line, on the safe, solid, dark shapes of trunks ahead. Behind us, I never heard the man step onto the ice. There were no additional footsteps, no crack of a gunshot, no shouted threats, just our ragged breathing and the dull slap of our boots and that endless, ringing quiet. When we finally hit the churned-up snow at the edge, I half fell, grabbing at low saplings to haul myself back onto land. We stopped for a second, bent double, listening. The far side of the reservoir was a sheet of flat gray, the man now just a small, upright blur near the edge. He hadn't moved closer. It was almost like he'd decided the risk of going out onto the ice after us wasn't worth whatever he was there to do. We didn't speak on the walk back to the truck. The path through the trees, which always took us maybe 3-4 minutes tops, felt like a mile and a half through a tunnel where the dark pressed in close. The moonlight filtered weakly through the branches, casting tangled shadows that looked too much like hands reaching. At one point, Blake's flashlight jerked down and lit up a tree trunk just off the trail, and all three of us stopped. There were deep, fresh gouges in the bark about waist high. Not the random scratching of an animal, but clean, parallel cuts like someone had dragged the edge of a knife or hatchet through it. Tacked just above them, nailed into the wood with a single rusty roofing nail, was a strip of faded orange fabric, the kind used for hunting vests. It was smeared with something dark and stiff. There were other bits of fabric caught on nearby branches, as if someone had yanked something or someone through here in a hurry. None of that had been there the last time we came. It suddenly made sense in a sick way, with the tracks Wed seen in the lot, the boot prints, the smaller steps, the way they had stopped dead at the truck. Aaron muttered that we should keep moving, voice rough and too loud in the silence, and that broke the spell enough for us to stumble the rest of the way to the clearing. The lot looked exactly as Wed left it, while also feeling completely different. The tire tracks were already softening under a dusting of new snow. No other vehicles had appeared. The whole world felt like a crime scene that had been half erased. Once we were inside the cab of the truck with the doors shut, the silence broke all at once. Everyone started talking at the same time. Questions, curse words, half-formed theories about hunters or poachers or someone dumping a dog. The rational parts of our brains threw out mundane explanations, but they all crumbled when we thought about the rope, the tarp-wrapped shape, the cracked helmet nailed to the tree, the missing poster Wed all walked past a dozen times at the gas station down in town, the one with the picture of a little boy in a winter coat, missing since last year, last seen near the state recreation area. No one wanted to say his name out loud in that moment. We argued briefly about what to do, whether we were overreacting, whether anyone would believe us, but by the time we hit the main road and passed the tiny sheriff substation on the way home, Wed silently agreed. We pulled in under the buzzing fluorescent light and went inside. Boots squeaking on the tile. Trying to explain it to the deputy behind the desk made it all sound insane. That Wed gone out on a frozen reservoir in the middle of the night because we liked the quiet. That Wed seen a man in some kind of fur suit dragging a heavy bag. That there'd been an old hole in the ice, and something that might have been, well, something. To their credit, the deputies didn't shrug us off. They asked us to go back through the story slowly, writing down details, circling the parts that were more than just vibes: the tire tracks, the 2 sets of footprints, the gouges in the tree, the strip of orange fabric, the coiled rope we thought Wed glimpsed near the edge of the reservoir before we ran. They sent a car out that night, but by the time they got there, the sky had clouded over fully and it had started snowing harder. The tracks were already blurring away. They found the gouged tree with the nailed fabric and took photos, then broke through the refrozen patch in the ice near where we'd pointed, pulling up chunks and shining lights into the black water. If they found anything, they didn't tell us. For a while, life went on like nothing had happened. We went back to school. Work got busy. The memory of that night settled into the same mental drawer as the car accident Blake had walked away from in high school, and the time a drunk at a bar followed Aaron to the restroom and wouldn't leave him alone until a bouncer stepped in. Scary as hell, but over. Then, a couple of months later, I was at my parents' place, half watching the local news while I scrolled my phone, when a segment came on about new developments in an ongoing missing persons investigation. They showed that same boy's photo again, only this time the banner read, "Remains believed to be those of missing child found in county reservoir." The anchor's voice was calm as she explained that anglers had spotted something unusual near the dam as the ice melted, that search teams had recovered partial remains and personal items, that authorities believed foul play was involved. They didn't name suspects, didn't describe how the remains were packaged or where exactly they had been found, but my stomach turned to stone anyway. The footage shifted to the reservoir, now mostly thawed, gray water lapping at the shore, crime scene tape fluttering in the breeze. You couldn't see the exact spot where Wed'd been standing or that weird old scar in the ice, but I could see, in my mind, the way the rope trailed behind the man, the way that bundle jumped and thumped. I muted the TV and just sat there, feeling this cold, prickling guilt I couldn't quite justify. We had done what we were supposed to do, I told myself. We had reported what we saw. We were just kids stumbling into someone else's nightmare in the space between snowstorms. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that the line between 3 guys who go walk on frozen water for fun and go home with a creepy story, and 3 guys whose names end up in a court transcript because they didn't get away fast enough was thinner than I'd ever understood. I haven't been back to that reservoir since when the first serious snow falls each winter. Part of me misses those nights, the way the ice turned into a mirror for the sky, the way we felt like the only 3 people left on Earth out there. The rest of me remembers tire tracks with no car, a cracked helmet nailed to a tree, and a man in a homemade fursuit standing at the edge of the world, deciding how much trouble we were worth. I know this all probably sounds like the kind of thing people exaggerate over time, but I can still picture that scene as clearly as if it's playing on a loop somewhere. The vast white, the distant upright figure, the small, dark bundle bumping along behind. If you've ever had a moment where something that started out as a harmless tradition or adventure almost tipped into something much worse, where you realized only later how close you might have come to someone else's darkness, I'd genuinely like to hear about it in the comments. Not for shock value, but because there's something grounding in knowing other people have brushed up against that edge and made it back too.